All right, hey guys, as demanded, we're going to have a look at context in art. Now, in your study design, in your booklet that I provided for you in the commencement program, you hopefully have read that the historical context is the context referring to the time and place in which the artist created the work, the artwork. Cultural context refers to the artistic, environmental, economical, social, technological, political, or religious climate of the time that may have influenced the artist. So I guess when we're reading this, we've got to start to look at the historical context refers to a time and place in which the artist created the artwork. So is there evidence of the time and place in which the artwork was created? If yes, then it's got a historical context. If no, then we can assume that most of it's going to come from cultural context, and vice versa. However, cultural context is going to probably be a part of nearly everything, whereas historical context may not. But on the most part, we're going to have both context in nearly all artworks we see. It's just depending on the amount of research and the amount of knowledge we understand about that artwork. In your exam, when it's an unknown artwork, that's where you've got to be really smart and choose an artwork that's going to help you talk easily about there being potentially both contexts in some form. So the cultural context: environmental, economic, social, technological, political, religious climate. So I guess first and foremost, you've got to start to look at the meanings and messages. So the context is important that we get this right, okay? Because if you don't get it right and you start talking in a 5-mark question, it's hard to come back from that. It's hard to get any marks. So we don't need to lock ourselves into an answer, but we can start to make some assumptions. So here's some artworks we've already previously looked at before, and we'll keep coming back to just as a reference point. Now this one's called Culture by Jane Perkins. So straight away, if you haven't thought that there's some sort of cultural reference, then you're out of touch with the system. So I guess we've got to look at, well, what's the meaning and messages from this? Does it reference a time and place which the artist created the work? It could be famous young girl Malalia, I'm not sure of her last name, stood up for rights of young girls, looked very similar to this in a photo. So it could be representing her stance. It could be representing culture in just the clothing style, dark hair, skin complexion, a few of those things. You could start to talk about culture, but first and foremost, let's look at the meaning and messages. I guess we can't stray away from the fact that those eyes are piercing at us. It's a stern look, a couple of those things. So if we go back to cultural context, all right, so there could be some social parts coming through. We could be looking at the role of women in society. We could be looking at them not having a political voice. It could be religious and them being shunned away and hidden behind clothing. There's a few things that sort of lean to this being more cultural than historical. However, if this artwork proves to have been related to the girl that I spoke about, then it's got a historical context. So it is more cultural than historical, however, it's both in it. So I guess at the moment we don't know much about this artwork, so we're making some assumptions there, and that's why we wouldn't lock ourselves into an answer. You guys in your SAC, however, are going to do extensive research so you can back your justification up with evidence. If this was an exam question about cultural context and you'd chosen this one, it's probably not an ideal choice. It'd be a great one to talk about elements and principles, textures, colors, etc. However, if you did choose this one for a cultural context, you would want to be making explicit references to what you think the meaning and messages are, and you wouldn't want to be locking yourself into an answer. So you could say the artist may be trying to communicate the strength of the woman by the stern look and the fierce focus in her eyes, and going from there. Let's take a look at another one. Again, this one here, very similar to the first one, there's not a great amount of time and place being represented here, so the answers would be similar. Okay, so we're going to look at the expressions, we're going to look at the meanings and messages, we're going to look at the color, we don't know much about this artwork, so we can't justify it being referring to a time and place when the artwork was created. This one here, on the other hand, we know Ned Kelly was a famous Australian person who lived in a specific time in a specific place. So Ned Kelly, being so infamous, would have this as quite a historical piece, right? Instantly, a figure of history in Australia has to refer to it being historical. Is it cultural? Yes, absolutely, because it's representing some of the culture of that time as well, but it's representing the environmental. It's also representing the economic. So he was a infamous bush stealing person. I forget the word, I'm going blank here. So it represented the economical downfall at the time, and the fact that they had to go to stealing money from each other. But all these things here from the cultural context come back to it being referring to the time and place. So it's in rural Australian towns. So the cultural context feeds off the historical context. So it is more of a historical piece that represents the culture of that time and place. So as opposed to these ones here that we can justify their cultural context more, and there is possibly a link to the historical context of that time and place. It's cultural context with history being part of it, whereas this one here is a historical context representing the meaning and messages of the culture of that time, if that makes sense. This Jackson Pollock, again, it's going to be really tough to pin this on a time and place. However, because Jackson Pollock has become so famous, this style of artwork could be now considered cultural of that time and place. The meanings and messages probably start to suggest, far more cultural perspectives of the art. Here we've got two artworks here. We've got an old style portrait here. We've got a young guy with a horse over here. If I didn't tell you who the artists were and I didn't tell you much about them, you're going to go that, well, these potentially have more of a historical context because there's a bit more time and place represented, especially for this guy. Whereas this one here, you might start to draw on cultural norms of that time and then look through that with a historical lens. That one's there again. Our 3D artworks, again, let's look at the meaning and messages first and then start to possibly make links to what you think they might be. These bottles here might represent a time or place, so that brings in a historical context. I guess what I'm trying to say is, with all these artworks, you have to be able to focus on both the historical lens and the cultural lens, and understand, well, which one may be applying more to this artwork and which one feeds through the other. So if you're looking at an artwork like the ones at the start here, well, there's more culture coming through, but if I knew a little bit more and did some more research, historical might come through more in this artwork. So I guess, for this sack in particular, you've got the advantage that you should be able to look up the meanings and messages behind your artwork, find out a little bit of background story, and then be able to make assumptions based on that evidence of, are your artwork cultural or historical? When we're in an exam, it's really important that we choose an artwork that we think we can talk strongly about being either historical or cultural. The bottom line is that most artworks are going to have both a historical and a cultural lens. However, one's probably going to play a bigger role in the artist's inspiration for choosing how and why they created the artwork that way, or simply just have a bigger role in the meanings and messages being conveyed. Hopefully that helps a little bit on the cultural and historical context while looking at artworks. Next, or in our class discussion, we're going to look at how that looks on pen and paper or as a written response.